When the temperature plummeted to 40 below and the power grid died, the residents of Crestwood thought the blackout would last a day. By day 20, they were burning their own furniture. By day 40, they realized the quiet, paranoid man at the end of the lane was their only chance. The town of Crestwood, Colorado, sat nestled in a picturesque valley that tourists loved in the summer and skiers flocked to in the winter. It was a place of deep complacency, where the greatest local drama was usually a dispute over property lines or the annual budget for the winter festival. No one paid much attention to Arthur Pendleton. At 64, Arthur was a retired supply chain auditor who had spent his career identifying vulnerabilities in massive global shipping networks. When his wife passed away 5 years prior, he retreated into his modest, single-story ranch house at the edge of the Pine Line. He was a ghost to the town, existing only as a polite nod at the hardware store or a quiet presence at the back of the local diner. But starting in early August of 2025, Arthur stopped being entirely invisible. He became an annoyance. It started with the deliveries. Heavy, unmarked 18-wheelers began navigating the narrow, winding dirt road leading to Arthur's property. His nearest neighbor, Beatrice Sullivan, a retired schoolteacher whose property overlooked his, spent her afternoons watching through her kitchen window as pallet after pallet was offloaded into Arthur's detached garage. At the September Town Council meeting, Mayor Richard Hayes, a man who cared more about Crestwood's aesthetic appeal than its infrastructure, made a public, passive-aggressive remark about unsightly industrial hoarding on residential lots. Arthur, sitting in the back row, simply stood up, adjusted his coat, and walked out. He didn't care what they thought. He had seen the meteorological models. He had spent his career analyzing statistical anomalies, and a terrifying confluence of atmospheric patterns was forming over the Arctic, one that the mainstream forecasters were dismissing as a low-probability outlier. Arthur knew that in the logistics world, low-probability events were the ones that broke the system. In silence, Arthur fortified his home. He spent tens of thousands of dollars draining his retirement accounts. He reinforced the joists in his basement to support the sheer weight of what he was bringing in. 6 500-gallon water bladders, industrial water filtration systems, and floor-to-ceiling shelving units bolted to the foundation. He stocked them with freeze-dried food buckets, 50-pound bags of rice and beans, cases of canned goods, and a comprehensive medical trauma kit. But Arthur didn't just plan to eat. He planned to live. He installed a massive, buried propane tank in his backyard, under the cover of night. He outfitted his roof with high-efficiency solar panels, disguised to blend in with the dark asphalt shingles, wired into a heavy-duty lithium-ion battery bank in his cellar. He purchased a high-end, heavily insulated wood stove and cord after cord of seasoned oak, stacking it meticulously in a wraparound shed attached to his back door. Finally, he installed custom-made insulated blackout shutters on the interior of every window. By late November, the deliveries stopped. The town went back to ignoring him. Beatrice assumed the old man had finally run out of money or lost his mind completely. Then came the week of Thanksgiving. The local weather station predicted a standard winter front, maybe 8 inches of snow. But the low-probability outlier Arthur had tracked finally snapped into reality. A massive, stationary high-pressure block formed over the Pacific, trapping a colossal, swirling vortex of Arctic air directly over the Rocky Mountains. It began on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky didn't just turn grey, it turned a bruised, violent purple. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. Then, the snow fell. Not in flakes, but in a dense, suffocating white wall. By Wednesday morning, Crestwood was buried under 4 feet of snow, and it was still coming down. The wind howled at 70 miles per hour, creating drifts that swallowed cars whole and buried front doors. At 2:14 p.m., under the immense weight of the ice and the ferocity of the wind, the main transmission lines feeding the valley snapped. The power went out. Inside his home, Arthur sat in his armchair, a cup of hot coffee in his hand. As the town plunged into darkness and freezing chaos, his battery bank seamlessly kicked in. His LED lights flickered once and held steady. The wood stove crackled, pushing the interior temperature to a comfortable 68 degrees. He walked to the window, closed the heavy insulated blackout shutter, and locked it. The longest winter had begun. The first 48 hours of the storm were marked by a bizarre, misplaced optimism. The residents of Crestwood treated the blackout like a sudden, unexpected holiday. Families huddled under blankets, lit decorative scented candles, and ate the ice cream melting in their freezers. But by Friday, the optimism violently fractured. The snow had not stopped. The accumulation reached an unprecedented 9 feet, with drifts towering over second-story windows. The temperature plummeted to 35 degrees below zero, not factoring in the wind chill. Cell phone towers, running on backup generators, failed one by one as their diesel supplies froze solid or ran dry. Landlines were dead. The single road leading out of the valley was buried under impassable, concrete-hard snowpack. Crestwood was completely, terrifyingly isolated. Panic is a quiet thing before it becomes loud. It started with the cold. Modern, poorly insulated suburban homes became iceboxes. Water pipes froze and shattered, flooding living rooms with water that instantly turned to slick ice. Breath plumed in bedrooms. On day 5, Thomas Gallagher, a local mechanic with a 2-year-old daughter, wrapped himself in 4 layers of clothing and forced his way out of a second-story window. He waded through waist-deep snow to Hank's Market, the town's only grocery store. He wasn't the first one there. The scene at the market was the beginning of the breakdown. The heavy glass storefront had been smashed in. Inside, it was a dark, frozen cavern stripped of anything useful. Canned goods, bread, batteries, and bottled water were entirely gone, looted in a silent frenzy the night before. Thomas found a single, dented tin of powdered milk trapped beneath a fallen shelf. As he dug it out, Deputy Samuel Jenkins, the highest-ranking law enforcement officer left in town since the sheriff had gone to Denver for Thanksgiving, stepped through the broken window, a flashlight trembling in his gloved hand. Samuel didn't draw his weapon. He just looked at Thomas, looked at the empty shelves, and realized that his badge meant absolutely nothing anymore. "Take it, Tom," Samuel whispered, his voice cracking from the bitter cold. "Take it and go home." By the second week, the town of Crestwood was dying. Mayor Richard Hayes had attempted to organize a shelter at the high school gym, dragging in portable propane heaters, but the massive space was impossible to heat, and the propane ran out in 3 days. Over 400 residents were crammed into the bleachers, coughing, freezing, and starving. The elderly began to slip away quietly in their sleep, victims of hypothermia. Arthur Pendleton, meanwhile, existed in a parallel universe of warmth and security. He kept to a strict, disciplined routine. He woke at 6 a.m., exercised in his basement, monitored the battery levels, and cooked hot, nutrient-dense meals, oatmeal with dried fruit in the morning, rich stews made from dehydrated beef, and vegetables in the evening. He kept the blackout shutters firmly sealed at all times. He knew that light leaking out into the pitch-black, frozen town would be a beacon, a death sentence. But Arthur made one critical miscalculation. He underestimated the olfactory senses of a starving, desperate human being. It was day 18. The wind had finally died down, leaving an eerie, dead silence over the buried town. Arthur was cooking a heavily spiced chili on his propane stove. He had cracked the chimney flue of the wood stove just a fraction too wide to let some smoke out, failing to realize that the scent of cooked meat and garlic was traveling on the frigid air. Beatrice Sullivan had not gone to the high school. She had stubbornly remained in her home, burning her dining room chairs in her fireplace to survive. She was out of food, heavily frostbitten, and delirious from hunger. Stepping out onto her back porch to gather a broken picture frame for firewood, she caught it. A smell so rich and impossible that she thought she was hallucinating. She followed the scent. She dragged herself through the snowdrifts, her frozen boots crunching loudly in the dead silence, until she reached the back of Arthur's property. She noticed something else, too. While every other house in town was crowned with feet of undisturbed snow, the snow around Arthur's metal chimney pipe was melted. Beatrice stumbled to Arthur's back door and began to pound on it with her freezing, bruised fists. "Arthur!" she croaked, her voice barely a whisper against the heavy wood. "Arthur, please, I know you're in there." Inside, Arthur froze, the wooden spoon halting over his steaming pot. His heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at the heavy deadbolts on the door. He could ignore her. He should ignore her. The brutal mathematics of survival dictated that his supplies were calibrated for one man, maybe for a year. If he opened the door, he opened himself to the chaos outside. "Arthur, I'm dying," Beatrice sobbed, slumping against the door. Arthur closed his eyes. He was a man of numbers, of logic, of cold, hard preparation. But he was still a man. Cursing himself, he walked to the door, disengaged the 3 deadbolts, and pulled it open. Beatrice collapsed into the mudroom, bringing a cloud of freezing vapor with her. As Arthur hauled her inside and slammed the door shut against the deadly cold, he looked down at her. She was staring past him, her eyes wide, taking in the impossible blast of heat, the glowing electric lights, and the heavy scent of hot food. Arthur got her warm, fed her a small bowl of broth, and set up a cot for her in the living room. He made her swear to absolute secrecy. Beatrice nodded, tears streaming down her weathered face, promising on her life that she wouldn't tell a soul. But desperation breeds betrayal, and secrets in a dying town are the hardest currency of all. 2 days later, while Arthur was in the basement rotating water stock, Beatrice found his backup, hand-crank emergency radio. She didn't use it to listen to broadcasts. She used the attached 2-way frequency, the same emergency channel Deputy Samuel Jenkins had been desperately monitoring from the frozen police cruiser outside the high school. Arthur walked upstairs just in time to hear Beatrice whispering frantically into the receiver. "Tons of it, Samuel. Food, heat, lights. He has a basement full of it. You have to come. You have to bring the children." Arthur yanked the radio from her hands, his face pale with horror. The radio hissed with static, and then Deputy Samuel Jenkins's voice crackled through the speaker, heavy with a dangerous, desperate realization. "Arthur," Samuel's voice echoed in the warm, brightly lit room. "Arthur Pendleton, we're coming." The longest winter was no longer just about fighting the cold. It was about to become a war for the only warm place left on Earth. The silence in the living room was heavier than the snow burying the house. Arthur stared at the hissing radio receiver in his hand, the plastic cracking under his tightening grip. Beatrice sat on the edge of the cot, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with the sudden, crushing realization of what she had just done. She had traded the absolute security of Arthur's sanctuary for the desperate, chaotic hope of the dying town. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice fracturing. "Arthur, I'm so sorry. I couldn't just sit here in the warm while the rest of them freeze." Arthur didn't yell. He didn't berate her. The time for anger had evaporated. The second Deputy Samuel Jenkins's voice broke the silence. Arthur was an auditor. He dealt in facts, in probabilities, in the cold, unyielding reality of supply and demand. And the reality now was that an armed, desperate mob was about to descend upon a house designed to sustain one, maybe two people. "You haven't saved them, Beatrice," Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly calm as he walked to the mudroom. "You've only ensured that we will all freeze together." He moved with mechanized efficiency. He engaged the secondary deadbolts on the heavy steel core doors. He checked the reinforced insulated shutters covering the windows, ensuring the internal steel locking pins were fully driven into the frames. He turned off the external perimeter cameras to save battery power, relying instead on a series of small, heavily frosted peepholes he had installed in the front door. 2 miles away, at the high school, Deputy Samuel Jenkins was rallying what was left of Crestwood's leadership. The gymnasium was a scene of apocalyptic despair. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, sickness, and the metallic tang of fear. Frost rimed the inside of the high windows. Mayor Richard Hayes, his face pale and eyes sunken, zipped up his heavy parka, his hands trembling. Thomas Gallagher, the mechanic who had found nothing at the market days prior, wrapped his 2-year-old daughter in layers of blankets, leaving her with his wife, Sarah, before joining the men. "We don't take it all," Samuel addressed the small group of men holding flashlights, tire irons, and hunting rifles. "We negotiate. He has a basement full of supplies. We get what we need to keep the children alive until the National Guard punches through the pass. That's it. We maintain order." But order was a luxury the freezing could no longer afford. The trek to Arthur's property took 3 agonizing hours. The snow was chest-high in places, the drifts packed into hard, icy barricades by the relentless wind. They moved in single file, taking turns breaking trail. A man named William, the local baker, collapsed a mile in. His heart simply gave out under the immense strain and the 30 below zero temperatures. They couldn't even bury him. They just marked his position with a ski pole and kept moving. Survival had stripped away their humanity, leaving only a primal, predatory urge for heat. When they finally reached the tree line of Pine Lane, they stopped. In the center of the pitch-black, frozen landscape, Arthur's house sat like a fortress. There were no lights visible through the heavy shutters, but the sheer lack of snow around the chimney and the faint, unmistakable smell of wood smoke slipping through the freezing air was a beacon. Samuel approached the front porch, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen wood. He knocked heavily, the sound flat and dead in the frigid air. "Arthur, it's Deputy Jenkins. We know you're in there. We know you have Beatrice. Open the door. We need to talk." Inside, Arthur stood by the front door, his hand resting on the icy steel of the frame. He peered through the thick glass of the peephole. He saw Samuel. He saw the hunting rifles slung over the shoulders of the men behind him. He saw the desperation in their hollow, frost-bitten faces. "Samuel!" Arthur's voice boomed through an external 2-way marine speaker he had wired under the eaves. The men jumped at the sudden, disembodied sound. "If I open this door, the thermal shock will compromise the microclimate I've established. If you all come inside, the oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide output will overwhelm my ventilation within an hour. The food I have is calculated in exact caloric increments. If I divide it by the 400 people at the school, we all starve in 6 days." "Listen to me, you selfish old bastard!" Mayor Richard Hayes pushed past Samuel, his voice cracking with hysteria. "People are dying. Children are freezing to death. You don't get to sit in there like a king while the town dies. Open the door, or we will break it down." "Richard, step back," Samuel ordered, putting a hand on the mayor's chest. But the crowd was murmuring, shifting their weight, hands tightening on their makeshift weapons. "You can't break the doors, Richard," Arthur's voice echoed through the speaker, unyielding. "They are commercial-grade steel, mounted into a reinforced frame. The windows are shuttered from the inside with ballistic resin panels. I am not a king. I am simply a man who did the math when the rest of you were arguing over the color of the Christmas lights." Richard lunged forward, swinging a heavy crowbar at the door. The metal clanged violently, but the door didn't even dent. The impact sent a painful, jarring shock up Richard's arms, dropping him to his knees in the snow. "Stop!" Samuel yelled, drawing his service weapon, though he wasn't sure who he was aiming it at. He looked up at the camera lens he assumed was watching them. "Arthur, please, look at us. I am begging you. As a human being. We have nothing left." Arthur closed his eyes inside the dark hallway. The logic of the spreadsheet in his mind told him to stay quiet, to let them freeze on his porch. But as he listened to the ragged, wheezing breath of the men outside, the rigid columns of his calculations began to blur. He was a survivor, yes, but surviving alone in a graveyard was a victory that tasted like ash. "I will not open the door," Arthur finally spoke through the intercom, "but I will establish a supply line. Drop your weapons, all of them. Kick them off the porch. If I see a single firearm, the speaker turns off and you never hear from me again." The men hesitated, but the bitter wind whipped around them, biting through their layers, forcing their compliance. Rifles and crowbars clattered off the wooden deck into the deep snow. "In the mudroom attached to the back of the house, there is a secondary airlock," Arthur instructed. "I will place 2 50-pound bags of rice, 4 cases of high-calorie survival bars, and a rolling tank of kerosene inside. I will lock the inner door. Then, and only then, you may open the outer door and take it. You will return tomorrow at noon for the next ration. Do we have an agreement?" Samuel nodded slowly, the relief washing over his frozen face. "Yes, we agree." "Thank you, Arthur." For the next 20 days, a brutal, mechanized routine settled over Crestwood. Arthur had become the reluctant quartermaster of a dying town. Every morning, he calculated the exact caloric output required to keep the survivors at the high school from succumbing to the cold. He dragged heavy sacks of grain, massive tins of dehydrated stew, and gallons of kerosene into the freezing mudroom, retreating behind the heavy steel inner door before unlocking the exterior one. The compromise had saved lives, but it was destroying Arthur's meticulously planned ecosystem. His calculations had never factored in the profound energy loss of opening the thermal envelope of his home every single day. Every time the mudroom door opened to the -30-degree air, the ambient temperature of his house plummeted. His battery bank, designed to run highly efficient LEDs and a small circulation fan, was now being drained by the massive surge required to reheat the house after every supply drop. Worse, the weather was actively fighting him. The continuous driving snow had piled so high on his roof that it was blocking the solar panels completely. The batteries were no longer charging. By day 40, Arthur was sitting in his basement by the light of a single, dimming LED bulb. Beatrice, wrapped in blankets, was coughing weakly on the cot. The ambient temperature in the house had dropped to 45 degrees. Arthur stared at the digital readout on his main inverter. Battery capacity: 12%. If the batteries died, the electronic ignition on the propane stove would fail. The water circulation pump for the internal pipes would stop, leading to an immediate, catastrophic freeze. His fortress was cracking from the inside out. He needed to clear the roof, but doing so meant exposing himself to the deadly wind chill for hours, suspended on an icy, sloped surface. At 64, Arthur knew his physical limitations. A fall would mean a broken leg, which, in this environment, was a slow, agonizing death sentence. When the noon supply run arrived, Arthur didn't just push the food out. He activated the intercom. "Samuel," Arthur said. "I need Thomas Gallagher." Thomas stepped forward, his face obscured by a thick scarf, his eyes dark with exhaustion. "I'm here." "My solar array is buried under 4 feet of compacted ice," Arthur stated frankly. "My systems are failing. If I lose power, the heat stops. If the heat stops, the supply line stops. I need a younger man to tether up and help me clear the roof. I will pay you with a direct, hot meal and 2 extra cases of formula for your daughter." Thomas didn't even look at Samuel for permission. He just nodded. "Let me in." The process of bringing Thomas inside was excruciating. Arthur had him strip off his frozen outer layers in the freezing mudroom, spraying him down with a dry, antibacterial foam before allowing him past the steel door. When Thomas finally stepped into the 45-degree house, he wept. To him, it felt like a tropical paradise. They didn't waste time. Arthur outfitted Thomas in a spare set of high-end, Arctic-grade climbing gear. They harnessed themselves to heavy-duty anchors Arthur had pre-installed on the chimney stack during the summer. Pushing through the roof access hatch, they were immediately hit by a wall of wind, so fierce it nearly knocked them off their feet. The world outside was a terrifying expanse of white and grey. The town of Crestwood looked like a moonscape, the rooftops mere bumps in the endless rolling drifts of snow. For 4 hours they battered the ice. They used heavy rubber mallets and plastic shovels, terrified of cracking the fragile solar glass beneath. The cold was a physical entity, chewing at their exposed skin, turning their fingers clumsy and numb. Thomas worked with the manic energy of a father fighting for his child's life, his breath freezing instantly against his scarf. Arthur's chest burned with a deep, terrifying ache. His vision blurred, the edge of the roof swimming dangerously. He was pushing his heart far beyond its capacity. Just as he felt his knees buckling, Thomas grabbed his harness, hauling the older man back from the slick edge. "I got it!" Thomas screamed over the howling wind, shattering the last massive block of ice covering the lower array. "It's clear. Let's get inside." They collapsed back through the hatch, sealing the cold away. Down in the basement, the inverter beeped. The digital readout blinked, registering the faint, ambient sunlight filtering through the storm clouds. "Charging." 13%. Arthur slumped against the concrete wall, clutching his chest, gasping for air. Thomas sat across from him, shivering violently but smiling. They had bought the town a few more days. But as it turned out, they only needed 1 more. On day 45, the low-probability atmospheric block finally shattered. The wind died completely, leaving a deafening, ringing silence in its wake. The purple, bruised clouds fractured, revealing a blindingly bright, painfully blue sky. Arthur was boiling water for morning oatmeal when he heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a mechanical, rhythmic thumping that vibrated in his teeth. He walked to the front door, unlatched the heavy steel pins, and swung the door open, stepping out onto the porch for the first time in a month and a half. The sun was blinding, and descending from the sky over the high school, kicking up massive clouds of white powder, were 3 dark green UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters. The Colorado National Guard had finally broken through the pass. Arthur watched as tiny, dark figures poured out of the high school, waving frantically at the sky. He watched the heavy transport trucks begin to crawl up the distant highway, equipped with massive snowblowers, cutting a black scar through the pristine white valley. The longest winter was over. Beatrice hobbled out onto the porch, wrapping a heavy quilt around her shoulders, tears streaming down her face. "They made it, Arthur." "We made it." Arthur didn't smile. He looked out over the frozen wasteland, thinking of the baker who had died in the snow, thinking of the desperate, animalistic terror in Mayor Hayes's eyes, and thinking of the terrifying realization that civilization was only ever 3 days of hunger away from collapse. He had stockpiled enough supplies to survive the end of the world, but he hadn't prepared for the sheer weight of what it meant to live through it. He turned back toward the dark, secure warmth of his house. "Yes," Arthur said quietly, closing the heavy steel door behind him. "We made it." If this story of survival, desperation, and the brutal reality of extreme preparation kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Would you have opened the door for the town, or kept your fortress sealed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, share this video with your friends to see what they would do, and don't forget to subscribe for more intense, real-life drama stories.